If you had told me about, say, 5 years ago, that one of the fastest selling Sonic games would be yet another remake of one of the best Sonic games ever made, I simply wouldn't believe you. If then were to tell me that the title of such a game began with the phrase Sonic X Shadow, I would then proceed to probably laugh you out of the room at that point, since that seems like a silly idea. No, but in all seriousness, Sonic X Shadow Generations has been dominating the market commercially, and honestly it astounds me, given the faulty track record that Sega has had with many of its other remakes. I mean, when you have people doing stacked tier list videos of the worst ways in which to play your games, you just know you must have screwed something up. But this game has managed to sell well over 1 million copies in just its first few weeks alone, and it's garnered positive reviews across the board from every gaming outlet I've seen so far. Even IGN has given it some praise, so you just know it must be good. So I waited a bit to let the hype die down a little, played the game for myself, and let all of what I experienced be absorbed thoroughly so I could have an honest opinion of the game and not just make another generic review on my initial thoughts. And so that's what this video is about. The main point of focus I want to showcase for Sonic X Shadow Generations is an aspect of the game which I think very little people have been talking about, and that is how it finally perfected the boost formula. Up until this point, the boost formula has kinda been the main gameplay style of the AAA Sonic games. It has by far the most games utilizing this gameplay style, not accounting for the classics of course, and Sonic X Shadow Generations is now the 6th iteration of this form of gameplay. So how does it stack compared to the rest of the Sonic catalog? Well, if you played the game like I have, it's safe to say Sonic X Shadow Generations isn't just simply better than the other Boost Sonic games, it straight up kicks their ass. Starting off with the game, one thing that I will immediately talk about is the amazing graphics. Dear God. The original Sonic Generations was not only one of my favorite Sonic games graphically, it might as well have been one of my favorite looking video games of all time, up there with Persona 5 in terms of art and aesthetics. The UI was crisp, bold, and colorful. The stylization for all the levels had this bright, saturated feeling to them, but with more grounded proportions, and the realistic texture work that brought even more fantastical ideas to life due to the gorgeous global lighting system of the Hedgehog engine, and just the gorgeous lighting and shadow in general. Top that off with the silky smooth 60 FPS, and you're looking at a pretty beautiful game, I reckon. Moving on to Forces, I felt like it was a huge downgrade in the graphics department, not just fidelity wise, but also in style too. Sonic lost a lot of his charm in basic stuff like his idle animations, striking the same pose after every homing attack chain, and even his running cycle became more mechanical and robotic as opposed to the more gradual and organic feel it had in Sonic Generations. Even though the shadow and lighting work in Forces was ultimately more detailed due to the more powerful Hedgehog engine 2, I feel like a lot of the series' style was washed away for more of that generic AAA feeling game that Forces was trying to go for. While the textures themselves might have had more detail, the design of these levels were often more static and boring to look at, simply due to the fact that their construction was far less interesting than in Generations. Take these two giant rock formations in the Green Hill Zone for example. In Sonic Generations, they have this bold, pronounced protrusion from the ground, each crest of the formation differing in height and slightly angled in an unorthodox way. Then you look at Forces rock formation, and it's almost symmetric all around. The entirety of the structure is made up of cubes that are way too perfect to actually exist in reality. They feel inorganic, unnatural, almost as if they were deliberately placed there in the game by the devs. And this graphical issue only gets more annoying in Sonic Frontiers, where in the open world segments, it's like they ditched the surrealist nature of Sonic's world entirely and opted for far more generic open world environmental design. It's a major complaint of the game itself, but the open zones don't feel like Sonic zones. They feel like you just took them and plopped them right into Unreal Engine 5. I will admit, for the cyberspace levels, they do return to that classic Sonic architecture like before, and it is better than Forces, but again, the environmental design still feels inorganic and manufactured, especially with all these repeating loops and hills in the backdrop. In Generations, these loops felt more like a part of the actual world itself, like they were just valleys and mountains that formed in that direction and Sonic was just using them to traverse through the land quickly. I always felt like that's what the classic games were trying to go for anyway, and they just didn't have the technology to pull it off yet. This is why I say till this day, Sonic Generations was my favorite looking Sonic game ever. It took the overly realistic adherence to reality that Sonic Unleashed had with its graphics and its environmental design, Design, mind you, that I think still looks absolutely gorgeous almost a decade and a half later, and it blended it with this more traditionalist architecture from the classic Sonic games level design, and it formed a visual identity that was not only striking, but super unique for the franchise, and remains its high point all these years later. So why, you might ask, am I telling you all this? Well, it may come as no surprise to you, but I think that Sonic X Shadow Generations absolutely destroys the original with its graphics, especially when it comes to that nice and sleek new UI it has. Dear God, it's so good. Shadow Generations style, yes I am calling it that for the remainder of this video, still keeps the classic design architecture from each of the levels it brought back, but it pairs it with a much more refined and detailed fidelity that honestly is just breathtaking to watch on multiple playthroughs. I mean, just look at this game, man. Shadow's hyper-detailed fur, the dynamic and visually stunning animations, the gorgeous reflective particle effects done to the water. Jesus, every body of water in this game is just simply eye candy. And even though this game does have an obvious use of reused textures and 3D models from previous games, those textures honestly have such good touch-up work done to them that I barely even notice most of the time. And this insane amount of graphical fidelity is all being processed at a smooth and silky 120 FPS. It makes playing this game simply cinematic, and that's without me even getting into the actual level and game design itself. I said in one of my other videos talking about Sonic Mania, yes, you should definitely go check that one out after this one, wink wink, that a game's level design isn't simply the actual terrain the player has to cover, but encompasses everything from the music and mainly the visuals as well. There is so much information you can feed the player through visuals alone of your level, it's honestly insane. And though I won't go into specific details like in Sonic X Shadow Generations, you can tell here that the developers used it excellently to its greatest potential. The visuals of your level are probably the most important aspect to any game's level design, whether you want to admit it or not, and this game absolutely nails it on the head in that department. Not only that, but I think that this game brings out the full potential of the Hedgehog engine too, easily, and I cannot wait to see what original level ideas that Sonic Team will be able to create now with the success of this game and the amount of skill and experience they now have under their belt. Now onto the aspect I know you people care about the most. I know what you all have been thinking, blah blah blah, so the game looks and sounds good. But what about that gameplay though? Well again, it's not surprising nor original for me to say this, but yeah, Sonic X Shadow Generations has some of the best modern level design out of any Sonic game to date. By a landslide actually. Wow, what a shocker. I think this game might even surpass the original Sonic gens in some places, so let me just go ahead and explain why. First off, not a lot of people talk about this, but this game managed to solve a problem plaguing the Boost Sonic formula for years now, and that is, Sonic always controlled pretty well in his boost state, but whenever you had to do any sort of complex platforming, you know, like an actual 3D platforming game, he would become stiff and really jittery, as Sonic's non-boost state movement is really imprecise and hard to control. As I've stated before, I think they should have made a system where if you're not going at boost speed, you revert back to the momentum-based physics of Sonic Adventure, but when you go into the boost state, you turn back into that unstoppable force of nature. Kind of like how he does in Sonic GT in that fan game. And while Shadow in this game doesn't do that, I can't say that he actually controls just as consistently good in his non-boost state as he does while boosting, more often than not. During my playthrough, I found myself consistently being able to do things like turning in midair, and being able to pull off slow and incremental movement adjustments in order to say save myself from a bad jump, or just get to a collectible that was at a really hard to reach area. Stuff that I know I wouldn't be able to do in any of the other boost games. And that was a genuine surprise to me, as it made the overall platforming just way more tight and fun as a result. And that's quite an amazing achievement if you ask me, because it now means that these Boost Sonic games could have far more traditional platforming sections without them feeling sluggish in that they're slowing down the pace, and they're actually polished now, unlike how they felt in Unleashed, Colors, and even Generations. I'm not gonna even talk about how bad this problem was in Forces and Frontiers. Ugh. And it seems like the game devs were self-aware about this improvement in the movement system, because the level design in Shadow Generations couldn't have used it any better in my opinion. I mean, can we just take a moment to realize that this game is actually more 3D than 2D for the first time in a Boost Sonic game? Think about that. All of the Act 1 stages are all in 3D and never devolve into any 2D sections whatsoever. Not that it even matters that much, since the 2D levels in this game are just as good, if not more engaging than some of the 3D ones. Just due to the better character controller and dynamic camera movement that utilizes the 3D nature of the gameplay style so effectively. You see, superstars? This is how you make a proper 2.5D level. And these aren't short levels by any stretch of the imagination either. No, these stages will easily take even an experienced Sonic player well over 4 minutes to complete on average, unless you're doing some crazy speedrunning strats that I've seen going around lately. Jesus guys, the game's only been out for 2 weeks, chill. And with such a large amount of time to complete each level, you must be thinking that surely these levels are stuffed to the brim with filler content, right? Stuff like waiting for platforms, straight lines where you just boost through tons of enemies. Nah, these levels are filled with awesome spectacle, actually challenging segments, and an numerous amount of alternating pathways that make my Seaside Hill pick as the best stage in Sonic Generations look like a complete joke in this game. I mean, look at some of these segments. This section in Kingdom Valley especially, I thought at some point I would reach some kill plane or invisible wall, but no, it just kept on going. The level just kept expanding, like the game devs were daring me to push the boundaries of their level design. It's truly incredible. And I like how in past Sonic Boost games, there was always this criticism levied at it, that it was boost to win and that there was no real thought in getting through each of these levels. And while that was never really a true sentiment, until we got the forces, I feel like Shadow Generations finally shows that this form of gameplay can have challenge to it, and it can have greater depth to its mechanics, other than just pressing the X button. This game is hard if you're not paying attention actively. Certain enemies will have a specific way you gotta take them out, moving targets that you have to use Chaos Spear on while moving in order to progress, lots of breaking and converging pathways, the use of Chaos Control to slow down objects in order to platform easier. It all just feels so organic and never forced. It's truly mind-boggling to think that these are the same level designers that worked on the Cyberspace levels, or dare I even say Sonic Forces levels, because the sheer glow-up on display is just simply immaculate. I didn't even mention stuff like the Radical Highway segments that have Shadow chasing after Black Doom, and this twisted Inception-esque level segment, which puts the game's amazing controls and physics to the ultimate test. The music, graphics, and level design, it all just converged to make you feel like the ultimate badass during these sections. And that's how I think I would describe most of this game's level design philosophy. From the use of Chaos Spears mid-movement, to the freezing of time in order to course correct yourself, or just set up for a sick action set piece. This game's design has the single-minded dedication of making the player feel like they're playing as an unstoppable force that is Shadow, the ultimate life form. And I certainly did feel that way when playing through every single level of this game. The funniest thing is, my only major complaint about this game is that there simply wasn't more levels and bosses to fight in the game. The game features only 6 levels and 4 bosses, one of which is only home to 1 level in the game, and then it just ends. Understandable due to the sheer amount of quality assurance that each level has, but man, it would have been nice to see at least 1 level from Shadow the Hedgehog. I mean, that was the Shadow game at the time, and I would have loved to see some homage to it other than just Devil Doom and the Black Arms. Oh well. It is what it is. On to the bosses. I'm not going to touch on these too much since they share a lot of the reasons why I like the levels in this game, but man, the spectacle is turned up to 11 for each of these iconic villains. I know Sonic Generations had this going for their boss fights, and it seems like this game decided to improve upon that aspect of the game, if only slightly. Each boss has essentially 3 phases, 2 combat ones, and the final cinematic phase where it's essentially just a cutscene of Shadow beating the crap out of them. Seriously, I know I'm not a power scaler or anything, but can we just take a moment to admire how much stronger Shadow has gotten over the years to be able to clear out Metal Overlord and Mephiles all by himself without any of the Chaos Emeralds? It just seems so hilarious to me, I don't know why. That being said, I do love the little thematic through line of each of these bosses being a failed version of Shadow to some extent. The Bile Lizard being the literal failed experiment by Gerald Robotnik, Metal Overlord being a metal clone of Sonic, the main inspiration for Shadow's creation, and Mephiles being created from the actual Shadow of Shadow. And even with the final boss being Devil Doom himself, is a neat little parallel in my opinion, as he represents a Shadow who cares about nothing other than his own power and superiority. A Shadow without a moral compass, from his friends in Maria. It's some pretty engaging stuff, and some subtle storytelling of Shadow having to face his past and overcome it, showing how far he's grown as a person, and it's certainly well appreciated after the decade of almost every Sonic character having their most interesting traits and personality bastardized over the years to its most bare-bones state for stupid comic relief. It's quite refreshing, I'll say. And I guess I'll let that lead me into the final part of this game I want to talk about, the story. I'm not gonna lie, this was by far the weakest aspect of the game for me. Not the cutscenes themselves, mind you. No, those all look gorgeous and really shows that the budget this game had from Sega was upped tremendously. No, the story itself is pretty okay for the most part. Not exceptional, but it's better than the original Sonic Generations, I will say that. Not that that was a high bar to pass or anything, but what are you gonna do? I'm not gonna waste much breath talking about the changed lines they did for the remake of Sonic Generations, other that most of them are dumb and unnecessary, and they don't even sync up well with the animations they made. But it's certainly not as big of a deal as certain people online have been making them out to be. No, instead, my gripes with Shadow's story mainly have to do with its presentation and execution, specifically in the dialogue. I'm just gonna say it right here that this might be the absolute worst I have heard Roger Craig's Sonic voice acting.
You have something I need.
You can wait until my business is finished.
Yeah, sorry, but that Chaos Emerald and I have a date with a monster.
Well then, it'll be a date to die for.
It sounds relatively childish and over-the-top cheesy, despite him putting on a serious act in the last game, and it just clashes so much with the tone of this game, it actively brought me out of the story whenever he spoke.
Nice hustle, but I won this one. So I'm taking the emerald. See ya!
And that was only for one cutscene, mind you. Like, you just gotta sit there and go, you know, I would have opted for another take on that one, I'm not gonna lie. Like, can we do a reshoot on that, or... And all of the voice acting for the other characters in the game, like Shadow and the aforementioned bosses, are completely fine. Shout out to Mephiles' voice actor, who added a whole new dimension to his personality with this aggressive and cocky attitude, and the underlying resentment and darkness he has for Shadow and his friend group. Seriously, it's all great stuff. Despite some cheesy dialogue here and there, every character takes their parts super seriously, and even the more goofier ones like Orbot and Cubot and... Oh my gosh, is that Big the Cat? Yeah, he's here for some reason. Glad he can make it, I guess. But back onto the story, the main gripe I have is the dialogue. It could have used a second draft in some areas, like with Maria for instance. Her character is reduced down to just a generic emotional support for Shadow. I don't think there's a single line of dialogue she has in the game that doesn't seem forced or overly dramatic, given the age of the character. Like seriously, I'm not gonna say I expected it to be Shakespearean or anything, but can you please show some emotion other than fear and concern? Just maybe? Also Gerald's here, I guess. His character is way more mellowed out this time around, as opposed to his SA2 self, where he was characterized more as an insane psychopath stricken by rage and guilt, trying to essentially kill everyone on the planet due to his own pain and suffering. Here he's far more chill and cool. The narrative paints him more as a sympathetic character, ripe with guilt and anger at the mistakes he made on the Space Colony arc all those years ago. And that's an interesting choice, I will say. I don't like how he espouses exposition most of the time, but again, it's not Shakespeare. I didn't expect an expert use of subtext and heightened dialogue in my Sonic Generations remake. It just gets the job done quite nicely. And the finale is actually pretty emotional, with Shadow shedding a tear, having to quite literally leave his past behind and move back into the future with Rouge, reflecting on that insane journey through time he had just had. And maybe we, the audience, think he's already gone through this arc before, but in real life you don't just get over stuff like that. It takes time, and it's cool to see that it still has an effect on him. It's genuinely emotional, and I'm happy that Sega is finally taking these characters and their stories more seriously now. Hopefully we will get back to the days of the storybook era and have another masterpiece in our hands. Overall, Sonic X Shadow Generations shows us why Sonic is still taken seriously as a force to be reckoned with in the gaming industry. Despite all of this franchise's failings, the fact that this franchise is still able to generate this amount of hype and success based on its IP really shows that Sonic truly is something special, and all you have to do is play this masterpiece in order to see why. I feel like this game represents all of the potential that Sega and Sonic Team have been building up all the way from their past experiences so far. This is truly the Sonic Generations 2 that we were promised with Forces, in my opinion. A true evolution of the gameplay in a satisfying and well-designed manner. A serious, emotional story that pushes its characters to greater heights while providing some satisfying spectacle, and a huge graphical update that I can only describe as being mesmerizing to see. Sonic X Shadow Generations is definitely worthy of all the praise and hype it's received, and I am ecstatic that it is doing so well currently, as it means we'll hopefully get an expansion to this new era of Sonic, as Sega sees it is far more popular and satisfying in the public eye. I can only end off this video by saying, you should definitely play the game for yourself if you have the time and money, and I hope that the next Sonic game will be wholly original, no remakes, no brought back stages, only original content, so we can get the true potential of a new gen Sonic game that we've all been waiting for these past few years. And with that, I can happily say, yep, Sonic is back, baby. And this game, Sonic X Shadow Generations, has successfully perfected the boost gameplay formula for Sonic. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed, be sure to comment, like, and subscribe, as well as share with a friend. I hope I catch you next time on this channel. Peace.